There are things you believe about your own life so completely that you forget they are beliefs at all. You believe you are loved. You believe the years you pour into a home, into a marriage, into the man you stood beside in front of witnesses and the law, those years amount to something that cannot simply be taken from you while you are standing right there in the room. I believed all of that for 12 years. On the 14th of November, in a courtroom in Ashford County, North Carolina, I watched a judge sign a single piece of paper that told me every one of those beliefs had been wrong. My name is Linnea Ashford. I am 40 years old. That morning, I walked out of the courthouse with a canvas tote over my shoulder, the legal death certificate of my marriage under my arm, and $43 in my bank account. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, though it was cold, from something quieter than cold, the particular trembling of a woman who has just been told by every official instrument the law could muster that her years of labor were decorative, that her love was supplementary, that she herself was a footnote in the story of a house that would have been nothing without her. What does a woman do when everything she built is taken from her in a single morning? I stood on the courthouse steps in the cold November wind, and I could not cry. The crying had ended somewhere around month 8 of the proceedings. What remained was heavier than grief and quieter than anger. What remained was silence. And then in the pocket of my coat, against my cold fingers, I remembered the brass key my grandmother had pressed into my hand the morning she died. She had whispered something to me that day, something I had not understood. I was about to understand it now. There are things you believe about your own life so completely that you forget they are beliefs at all. You believe you are loved. You believe the years you pour into a home, into a marriage, into the man you stood beside in front of witnesses and the law those years amount to something that cannot simply be taken from you while you are standing right there in the room. I believed all of that for 12 years. On the 14th of November, in a courtroom in Ashford County, North Carolina, I watched a judge sign a single piece of paper that told me every one of those beliefs had been wrong. My name is Linnea Ashford. I am 40 years old. That morning, I walked out of the courthouse with a canvas tote over my shoulder, the legal death certificate of my marriage under my arm, and $43 in my bank account. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though it was cold, from something quieter than cold, the particular trembling of a woman who has just been told by every official instrument the law could muster that her years of labor were decorative, that her love was supplementary, that she herself was a footnote in the story of a house that would have been nothing without her. What does a woman do when everything she built is taken from her in a single morning? I stood on the courthouse steps in the cold November wind, and I could not cry. The crying had ended somewhere around month 8 of the proceedings. What remained was heavier than grief and quieter than anger. What remained was silence. And then, in the pocket of my coat, against my cold fingers, I remembered the brass key my grandmother had pressed into my hand the morning she died. She had whispered something to me that day, something I had not understood. I was about to understand it now. But before I tell you about the key, I have to tell you about Ransom Carrington. Because without that telling, you cannot understand what came next. You cannot understand why a woman of 40 would drive 2 hours and 40 minutes into the Blue Ridge Mountains with $43 and a key she had not looked at in nearly 2 years. You cannot understand the shape of a marriage that looked beautiful from the outside and was wrong in its bones. You cannot understand how a woman who had been raised by careful, loving people could find herself at 40 on a courthouse step with nothing. So I will tell you, I met Ransom Carrington in the autumn of 2010. I was 26. I was working as an assistant curator at a small contemporary gallery on Lexington Avenue in Asheville. The pay was modest. The work was everything. I had grown up loving paintings the way some children love horses or stars, without explanation, without permission, without anyone needing to teach me. My grandmother Ottilie had given me my first set of watercolors when I was 4. She had set them in front of me on her kitchen table in the cabin she would not bring me back to for many years, and she had said, very seriously, as if she were addressing another grown woman, "Sweetheart, your hands are going to be more beautiful than anything they ever make." I did not understand her then. I understand her now. The night I met Ransom, I had curated a small show of regional landscape painters, Blue Ridge winter scenes, bare trees, pale skies. The particular austere beauty of southern mountains in February, when the cold has stripped everything down to its essential structure. I had hung the show myself. I had chosen the lighting. I had spent 3 days deciding the order of the paintings, because the order of paintings in a room is a sentence, and sentences matter. He walked in at 8 o'clock wearing a well-cut navy blazer and the easy confidence of a man who has never once in his life been uncertain about his reception in a room. He stopped in front of the largest piece, a winter landscape by an artist named Edmund Beale, all gray sky and silver branches, and the suggestion in the lower third of a frozen creek catching what little light there was. He stood in front of it for a long time. I was standing directly behind him, arranging brochures on a side table. He spoke without turning around. "Whoever hung this painting," he said, "understood something about how light behaves when it has nowhere to go." I went very still. He turned. He smiled. There was nothing calculated about the smile. That was the thing. That was always the thing. The smile of a man who is genuinely interested in what you have to say, who has just paid you the kind of compliment that only another person who looks carefully could pay. The smile of a man who notices. I should have known then. I should have known that a man who notices beautiful things is not, by virtue of noticing, a man who knows how to care for them. But I was 26, and he was 32, and he was looking at me as if I had just become the most interesting object in a room full of objects he had come to look at. And I said something, I cannot remember what, and he laughed and asked if I would have coffee with him the following Saturday, and I said yes, and the door of my life swung wider, and I walked through. We were married 3 years later. The wedding was in October on the grounds of the Carrington estate. The grounds were beautiful. The October light in the Blue Ridge foothills is the kind of light painters spend lifetimes trying to capture and never quite get right. I wore my mother's lace, altered by a seamstress in Asheville who cried when she fitted me because she had known my mother before I had. Ransom wore charcoal. His mother wore navy. The minister was an Episcopal priest from the church the Carringtons had attended for 4 generations. There were 140 guests. There was no one from my side of the family except my grandmother. My mother had died when I was 19. My father had remarried and moved to Oregon, and we spoke at Christmas and on birthdays, and that was the shape of our relationship. My only living relative who had truly known me, who had watched me grow up, who had taught me how to hold a paintbrush and how to identify the call of a barred owl and how to make biscuits from scratch with the lightest possible touch, was Ottilie Ashford. My grandmother, my mother's mother, the woman who had pressed the watercolors into my 4-year-old hands. She came to the wedding in a pale green wool suit. She was 77 years old. She walked carefully but without a cane. Her hair was the color of pewter. Her eyes were the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every morning of my life. She did not smile during the ceremony. I noticed it at the time and did not let myself notice it. At the reception, she pulled me aside. We stood by the rose garden wall. The afternoon had gone gold around us. She held both of my hands and she looked at me in that direct, unhurried way she had, the way of a woman who had spent her whole life paying attention to things that other people overlooked. "Sweetheart," she said. "Yes, Grandma. You remember the cabin?" Of course I remember the cabin. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked at me, and then she said, "Whatever happens, you remember the cabin. You remember that it is there. You remember that I built it. You remember that it is for you." I laughed a little. I thought she was being sentimental in the way the elderly sometimes are at weddings. I thought she meant, "I love you." I thought she meant, "Don't forget where you came from." I did not understand that she meant something else entirely. I kissed her cheek. I said, "I'll remember, Grandma." She squeezed my hands once, hard, and then she let go, and I went back to the reception, and I did not think about the cabin again for a long, long time. I moved into the Carrington estate after the honeymoon. The estate, I have said the word, but I have not described it. It sat on Harrington Hill, 15 minutes outside Asheville, set back from the road by a long gravel drive lined with century-old boxwoods that had not been pruned in 2 decades. The house was a 12-room Georgian manor built in 1924 by Ransom's great-grandfather, a man who had made money in textiles and then in timber, and who had wanted a house that announced the making of that money to anyone who came up the drive. Brick, white columns, a slate roof that had been patched and repatched until it leaked in 3 rooms. Original plaster moldings that had not been visible in 30 years because 40 years of unfortunate paint choices had buried them. A kitchen that had last been updated in 1981 with linoleum the color of old butter and cabinetry that had been built competently but without imagination by a contractor in 1962. And underneath all of it, bones. The house had bones. I knew it the moment I walked in. I knew it the way you know when you meet a person that there is more inside them than they are currently showing you. The house was waiting. It had been waiting since 1962 to be seen by someone who knew what it had been and what it could be again. I was that person. I did not know I was that person on my wedding day. I figured it out over the next 6 years, room by room, plaster by plaster, with the patient, focused, devotional love of a woman who had finally found work that was large enough to hold every part of her. The first room I did was the dining room. I stripped 70 years of paint off the plaster crown molding with a heat gun and a putty knife, and I did it myself because I had asked 3 contractors to quote the job, and all 3 of them had told me they would simply install new molding because it would be cheaper. I told them no. The molding was original. The molding was 1,924. The molding was the bones of the room. I did not want new bones. I wanted the bones that had been there since before my husband's grandfather was born. I did it on weekends. I did it in the evenings after my work at the gallery. I did it with the radio playing softly in the corner. I did it with my hair tied up in a kerchief and plastered dust on my face. And when I was finished, when the crown molding emerged from under the paint like a body emerging from water, I sat on the dining room floor and I cried. Ransom came in. He saw me crying. He said, "Linnea, sweetheart, why are you crying?" I said, "Look at it. Look at what's been here the whole time." He looked at the molding. He looked at me. "It looks great, honey," he said. And then he went back to his study. It was the first sign I did not see it. I should say, it was not exactly that he did not care. It was that he could not see. He had grown up in this house. The molding had been buried in paint for his entire life. He had no relationship with what it had been before. He had no concept of the work it had taken to bring it back. He saw a successful renovation project. He saw a wife with plaster on her face. He did not see what I had done because what I had done was invisible to him. It had never been part of his experience. I told myself this was fine. I told myself 1,000 small lies in those years, and that was the first of them. I did the dining room. then the library, then the front parlor, then the back parlor, then the second floor hallway with its original transom windows that had been painted shut for 40 years, then the master bedroom, then the 4 guest rooms, then the kitchen. The kitchen took 14 months because I had to source period-appropriate cabinetry from a mill worker in Charleston who was nearly 80 years old and who only worked when he felt like it, and because the linoleum had glued itself to the original heart pine floor in a way that required 8 separate weekends to address. I drove to Virginia, to Georgia, to South Carolina. I went to estate sales. I went to architectural salvage yards. I went to small antique shops in towns whose names I had never heard before. I was looking for hardware, door handles, window latches, hinges, the right pieces, pieces from the period, pieces that the house would recognize. I once drove 6 hours one way to look at a set of brass window latches in a barn outside Lynchburg. They were perfect. They were exactly what I needed. The man who sold them to me was 91 years old and had inherited the barn from his father. He sat in a folding chair in the doorway while I crouched in the dust and inspected each latch by flashlight. He said, "You must love that house a lot, miss." I said, "I do." He said, "Then you'll find a way." I paid him $300 for the latches. I drove home in the dark. I installed them the following weekend. They fit perfectly. I think about that old man sometimes. I think about how he saw me, a woman alone in his barn, looking at hardware by flashlight, and how he understood, without needing me to explain, what I was doing and why. He saw me, a stranger in a barn saw me. My husband, in our own house, did not. The first regional architecture magazine featured the estate in the spring of 2018. The article was 4 pages long. It included 6 photographs. It described the renovation in glowing terms. It mentioned the period-appropriate hardware. It mentioned the recovered crown molding. It mentioned the heart pine floors. It mentioned the restored transom windows. It used phrases like thoughtful stewardship and historically sensitive restoration. The article was about ransom. My name appeared once in the 7th paragraph, in the phrase, Carrington and his wife. That was it. I read the article in our kitchen on a Sunday morning. Ransom was at the table with his coffee, reading the business section. I read the article twice. I set it down. I did not say anything. He looked up. He said, "Nice piece, isn't it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm glad they got the photographs right. The light in the library is impossible to shoot." I did not say I positioned those lamps. I chose that light. I spent 8 months deciding where the lamps would go because the light in that room had been wrong for 40 years and I wanted to make it right. I did not say it. I said, "Yes, the photographs are nice." That was the second sign. I did not see it either. A second magazine ran a longer piece in 2019. The Blue Ridge Preservation Society sent a commendation letter in the same year. It was addressed to Ransom. It thanked him for his contribution to the architectural heritage of the region. He had it framed in a gold frame and hung it in his study. I helped him hang it. I held the level while he placed the nail. I stepped back to make sure it was straight. I said, "A little to the left." He moved it. He said, "Better?" I said, "Perfect. I want you to understand something. I am not telling you this to make him sound like a monster. He was not a monster. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous than a monster. He was a man who had been raised to believe in ways so deep he could not have articulated them if he tried, that the work of women in the world around him was the natural texture of his life, there to be enjoyed the way the climate is enjoyed, without thought, without acknowledgement, without any particular consciousness that someone had built it. The crown molding was beautiful. The molding had always been beautiful. The wife was lovely. The wife had always been lovely. The house had been restored. The house was simply restored now. It was not malice, it was something worse than malice. It was the absolute, complete inability to register that another person was doing something. You can survive malice. Malice at least sees you. Malice knows you exist. You cannot survive being unseen. I did not know that yet. I was learning it. I was learning it in increments so small that no single increment could have been called the moment things changed. There was no moment. There were 6 years. By the time the marriage ended in the way these things end, which is to say, not on the day it ends, but years before, in slow accumulations that only become visible in retrospect, I had restored every room of the Carrington estate. I had pruned the boxwoods back to their proper shape. I had recovered 7 original fireplaces. I had stripped and refinished the front door to a color I had matched from a photograph of the house taken in 1924. I had spent 6 years inside the bones of a building that I had come to love the way you love. A child you have raised completely, irrationally, and with the specific knowledge that you have given it a great deal of yourself. And then it was February of 2023. I had been in Asheville all morning. I had a meeting with a private collector about a curatorial consultation. I had gone back to freelance work by then, fitting my schedule around Ransom's, which was the polite phrase for fitting my schedule around the fact that he did not want me to have a schedule. The meeting had gone well. I had been pleased with myself. I had stopped at the small bakery on Charlotte Street and bought a loaf of sourdough because Ransom liked sourdough, and I was feeling generous and untroubled, and like a woman who could surprise her husband with a small kindness on a Tuesday afternoon in February. I drove home. I parked. I came in through the side door, which led directly into the kitchen, because the kitchen was where I always came in. There was a woman at my kitchen table. She was approximately 30 years old. She had dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that I would later learn had been a gift from my husband for her birthday the previous October. She was drinking coffee. She was drinking coffee from my favorite mug. The mug had been a gift from my grandmother, a hand-thrown stoneware mug from a potter in Tennessee, glazed in a particular shade of dark green that my grandmother had said reminded her of the lake at the cabin in late autumn. I had drunk my morning coffee from that mug for 10 years. The mug was mine. The mug was specifically and unambiguously mine. The woman at my kitchen table was holding my mug with both hands. She was holding it in the relaxed, unhurried way of a person who has held it many times before. She looked up when I came in. She did not look startled. She looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. Ransom was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. He had his arms folded. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, the expression of a man who has been postponing something for a long time and has finally run out of the energy required to keep postponing it. He said, "Linnea, we need to talk." I set the sourdough on the counter. I did not say anything. The woman set down my mug. She looked at Ransom. He nodded once. She picked up her purse from the chair beside her, and she walked past me without making eye contact. She smelled like a perfume I did not recognize. The side door clicked shut behind her. I looked at my husband. I looked at the mug on the table. I looked at my husband again. He said, "Sit down." I did not sit down. He said, "Linnea, please." I said, "How long?" He did not answer. I said, "How long, Ransom?" He said, "It doesn't matter how long." I said, "How long?" He said, "About a year." About a year. I want to tell you that I did the things a woman is supposed to do in that moment. I want to tell you that I screamed, that I threw the mug, that I picked up the loaf of sourdough and hit him with it, that I behaved in any way that would suggest the situation was being met with the appropriate emotional response. I did not do any of those things. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen I had spent 14 months restoring with the cabinetry I had sourced from an 80-year-old millworker in Charleston, with the heart pine floor I had uncovered weekend by weekend, with the light fixtures I had chosen to match the period, and I felt something inside me go very still and very cold. I said, "Get out of my kitchen." He said, "Linnea, this is my house." There it was. There was the sentence. I had been married to him for 11 years and 4 months. I had restored every room of his family's estate. I had given him my labor and my love and my professional knowledge and my taste and my eye and the most productive years of my adult life. And in the first 60 seconds, after I had found another woman at my kitchen table, he had told me, without apparent awareness, that he was telling me exactly how he thought of all of it. This is my house. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said very quietly, "Yes, I see that it is." I walked out of the kitchen. I went up the back stairs to the bedroom. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed. I had had reupholstered the previous year in a French linen I had ordered from a fabric house in New Orleans. I put my hands in my lap. I did not cry. The crying came later. The crying came in waves over the following weeks in the bathroom of an extended stay hotel in West Asheville, where I lived for 41 days while I tried to figure out what to do, in the front seat of my car, in the parking lot of a Harris Teeter, in the small office I had rented above an antique store on Lexington Avenue when I tried to begin freelance consulting again at 39 and realized that I had been out of the formal workforce for too long, and the contacts I had once relied on had moved on or retired or forgotten me. The crying came, but not in the kitchen. In the kitchen, I went still. He had already retained an attorney. I learned this within the week. His name was Caspian Voss. He was expensive, precise, and specialized in what I can only describe as the management of marital dissolution in favor of the spouse who had structured the marriage. He had been working for Ransom for 14 months. 14 months. The financial architecture of our marriage had been quietly redesigned for over a year before I had ever seen the woman in the cashmere sweater. The household accounts had been separated. The business interests had been restructured. The titles and the deeds had been reviewed and confirmed and reconfirmed. The Carrington estate had always been in Ransom's name alone, a family trust requirement, he had told me early in our marriage. The estate has to remain in the Carrington name, sweetheart. It's a family thing. You understand. I had understood. I had been 28 and in love. I had not asked the questions a 38-year-old me would have asked. I had not thought about what it meant. I thought about it now. My attorney was a woman named Sloane Petrov. She was in her early 50s. She had iron gray hair cut short and very pale blue eyes, and a way of listening that made you feel, while she was listening, that nothing else in the world was happening. She was genuinely angry on my behalf, in the focused, useful way that the best attorneys are angry. But she was working against 14 months of preparation. She was working against the structural fact of a deed that had only ever borne one name. She was working against a legal system that had not yet caught up with the question of what a woman's labor is worth when that labor has been poured into something owned by someone else. The proceedings lasted 14 months. 14 months of depositions, 14 months of filings, 14 months of hearings in small wood-paneled rooms in the Ashford County Courthouse, where Caspian Voss sat with his pen and his careful smile and his arsenal of documentation, and where my 6 years of restoration work were systematically characterized on the record, in writing, under oath, as household management and interior design assistants. In the seventh hearing, Caspian Voss said the sentence. He said, "Your Honor, the petitioner decorated the property. She decorated the property. The words landed on me the way ice water lands, the way a particular kind of public humiliation lands, not as fury, but as a kind of cold understanding. Decorated, as if I had chosen throw pillows, as if I had not spent 6 years in the structural bones of a 1924 Georgian manor with a heat gun and a level and the accumulated knowledge of years of careful study, as if my labor had been ornamental, as if I had been ornamental." Sloan Petrov objected. The objection was noted. The proceedings continued. The judge ruled on November 14th. The estate went to ransom. The lump sum I received was calculated on the assumption that my restoration labor had no quantifiable professional value. I was given 30 days to collect my personal belongings from the home I had brought back to life. I packed what mattered into 3 bags and a single cardboard box. I left everything else. The brass window latches from Lynchburg stayed. The kerchief I had used to tie my hair back during the dining room work stayed. It was hanging on a hook in the laundry room, and I forgot it, and I did not go back for it. The mug stayed. I could not bring myself to take it. The mug had been mine, but the mug had touched her hands, and I did not want it anymore. I put my mother's small wooden jewelry box in the top of the last bag. Inside that box, in a small envelope I had not opened since the day my grandmother died, was a brass key. I drove away from the Carrington estate on a clear November morning. I did not look back. Looking back would have meant seeing the boxwoods I had pruned, and the front door I had refinished, and the brass window latches, and the heart pine floors, and the crown molding emerging from under 70 years of paint. Looking back would have undone me, and I could not afford to be undone. I drove to the courthouse. I signed the final documents. I walked out into the cold November wind, and that is where this story began. And that is where, if I am being honest with you, I had every reason to believe my story was ending. I stood on the courthouse steps for a long time. The wind moved through Ashford. A woman came out behind me in a heavy coat, and she walked past me down the steps without looking at me, and I thought, that is what I am now. That is what I will be from now on. A woman in a coat, walking past other women on courthouse steps, on my way to whatever comes next. And then my fingers in the pocket of my coat brushed against the small, hard shape of the brass key. I had taken it out of the jewelry box that morning. I do not know why. I had not thought about it consciously. I had simply, before leaving the hotel, lifted the lid of the box and seen the envelope and removed the key and put it in my pocket. The way you sometimes do things that you do not understand until later, I closed my hand around it. I remembered the morning my grandmother had died. It had been 8 months earlier, March of 2023. She was 87 years old, and she had been failing for most of the previous year, and the family had gathered at the hospital in Asheville to say goodbye. There had been my Aunt Coraline and my Uncle Barton and my 2 cousins and my father, who had flown in from Oregon, and there had been me. I had spent the last night of her life sitting beside her bed, holding her hand, while the morphine moved her in and out of awareness. In one of her lucid moments, very early in the morning, before the others arrived for the day, she had turned her head toward me. Her eyes were clear, her voice was thin but precise. She had said, "Linnea." I had said, "I'm here, Grandma." She had said, "There is a nurse, a young woman, kind face, brown hair. She has something for you. Take it. Do not show it to your aunt. Do not show it to anyone." I had said, "All right, Grandma." She had said, And Linnea, "Yes, Grandma, when you have nowhere left to run." I had said, "Grandma," she had said, "promise me, not before, when you have nowhere left to run." I had not understood her. I had thought she was confused. I had said, "I promise, Grandma." She had closed her eyes. She had squeezed my hand once, hard, the way she had squeezed my hands at my wedding 11 years before. She died at 4:12 in the afternoon. The young nurse, kind face, brown hair, exactly as my grandmother had said, pressed the envelope into my hand in the hallway outside the hospital room while the family was gathered around the body inside. She did it quickly. She did it without speaking. She did it the way a person does something they have been instructed to do and want to do correctly. I opened the envelope in the hospital parking garage. Inside was the brass key, long-shafted, old-fashioned, with a bow at one end shaped like a small sunburst, and a single folded note in my grandmother's careful, deliberate handwriting. "Linnea, take the key. Go to the lake cabin when you have nowhere left to run. Not before. When. I love you across every year, Grandma Ottilie." I had sat in the hospital parking garage for a long time, the engine running, the heat on, my hands shaking. I had folded the note. I had put the key back in the envelope. I had put the envelope in my mother's wooden jewelry box. And I had put the box, because life was moving and grief was moving and there were arrangements to be made and a funeral to plan and an estate to settle, in the bottom drawer of the bureau in the upstairs hallway of the Carrington estate, and I had not looked at it again. Not for 8 months. Not until the courthouse steps. Not until the wind and the $43 and the canvas tote and the legal death certificate of my marriage. Not until I had nowhere left to run. I stood there on the steps with the key in my hand, and I thought about the cabin. The family had always spoken of it the way people speak of an inconvenient inheritance, too sentimental to discard, too run down to be worth anything, too far away from any place worth going to concern anyone seriously. A 3-room cabin on the western shore of Lake Halvern, 40 minutes into the Blue Ridge foothills west of a small town called Crestwick, population approximately 1,200, with a single commercial block and a gas station that closed at 9. My grandmother had bought the land in 1975. She had built the cabin the following summer. She had gone there every summer for most of her life. And then, around 2010, she had quietly stopped making the drive, the roads we had assumed. Her age, the isolation. My Uncle Barton had once floated the idea of selling it at a Thanksgiving dinner when the Blue Ridge real estate market was beginning to climb. My grandmother had said, very quietly and without raising her voice, that the cabin was not part of the dinner conversation, and she had redirected the table toward the sweet potato casserole, and no one had pushed. No one had been back since my mother's brief inspection visit in 2018. The roof had moss. The dock was half rotted. "That place will fall into the lake before anyone gets a use out of it," my mother had said, and the family had nodded, and that had been that. I had not thought about the cabin in years. I thought about it now. I closed my hand around the key. The brass was cold against my palm. The little sunburst at the bow pressed into my fingers. When you have nowhere left to run, I had nowhere left to run. I turned my back to the courthouse. I walked down the steps. I crossed the parking lot to my car. I started the engine. I sat for a long moment with my hands on the wheel, looking at nothing. Then I pulled out of the lot. I drove west. The road climbed gradually at first, through the long, pale fields of the Piedmont, and then more steeply into the foothills, where the trees began to close in over the highway. The light was thin and clean. The hardwoods had been stripped to their bones by November. The pines stood dark on the ridgelines. I passed through small towns whose names I knew from childhood: Black Mountain, Old Fort, Marion, and the road climbed, and the air through the cracked window changed from highway exhaust to pine resin to the cold creek smell of high country in late autumn. Something in my chest that had been clenched since February of 2 years before began, very slightly, to loosen. Not heal, not hope, just loosen, the way a knot loosens when you stop pulling against it. I passed Crestwick at the late afternoon fall of the light. The single commercial block had a hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner with hand-painted hours on the window glass, and a small Victorian building with gold leaf lettering, Halloway and Halloway. Attorneys at law. I noted it without understanding why I was noting it. The county road west of Crestwick narrowed steadily. The signage thinned. The pavement ended at the lake access point and became gravel, and then the gravel became a two-track path through dense hemlock and rhododendron that required low gear and careful attention. I crept along it, the sedan dragged once on a buried root, and then the trees opened without warning, the way mountain clearings announce themselves, and I stopped the car. Lake Halvern lay in front of me. It was the color of cold mountain water under a white-gray sky. There were no boats on it in November. There were no sounds. The hardwoods around its edges were stripped to silver branches. The pines stood in their year-round dark on the ridges above. The stillness of the water was so complete that it looked less like a lake than like a photograph of one, like something preserved in glass. The cabin was visible on a slight rise above the western shore. I recognized it the way you recognize places from childhood, not as they are, but as they were, filtered through the distortions of memory and time and all the ways you have grown since you last saw them. It was smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I had been small when I was last here, and the cabin had fit the world I inhabited then. Cedar shake siding, weathered from its original dark green to a muted gray-green that looked almost as if it had grown from the landscape rather than been placed on it. A screened porch across the front, a porch door secured by a padlock through a hasp, a stone chimney at the east end of the roof, old white pines on three sides, with their lower branches nearly touching the roofline. Every window was shuttered, wooden storm shutters latched from outside, uniform, deliberate. The cabin had not been abandoned. It had been sealed. There is a difference between a place that has been forgotten and a place that has been waiting. Standing beside my car on the gravel track in the fading November light, I understood very clearly which of those this was. I sat in the car for one more minute. I held the brass key. Then I got out and I walked through the tall, dead grass toward the porch, and I did not yet know that the next 30 minutes of my life would change everything I thought I knew about my grandmother, about my marriage, about the years I had given to a man who had taken them, and about the woman who had been quietly, patiently, building a door for me to walk through for 50 years before I would ever need to find it. I climbed the porch steps. I put the key in the rusted padlock. I turned it. The padlock fought me. 2 full minutes. The key caught, released, caught again. My hands were numb, not just from the cold, though it was cold, from the shaking that had nothing to do with the cold. And then, with a grinding, reluctant sound that felt less like a lock opening and more like a verdict being reversed, the hasp fell open. I stood on the porch. I did not step inside yet. I looked. 2 Adirondack chairs in faded red paint, a small side table between them, a ceramic mug on the table washed clean, placed deliberately, the way you place a thing when you expect someone to come and find it. A hanging fern basket from the porch rafter on a small iron hook, the fern long dead, the basket still intact. Someone had tidied before they left. Someone had expected whoever came next to find things in order. The inner door was solid pine, a Z-brace across its face. The wood aged to a warm, dark brown. There was a keyhole and a slide bolt. The slide bolt was not engaged. I put the brass key in the lock. It turned, smoothly, cleanly, the way a thing turns when it has been maintained by someone who understood that the right person would, eventually, come. The door swung inward. Cold air first, the kind of cold that lives in sealed spaces, and then the smell. Cedar, sharp, clean. Underneath the cedar, something older, something sweeter, dried lavender, the ghost of wood smoke from a fire laid years ago, the particular smell of a space that has been sealed with care, that has been protecting itself, that has been holding. I stepped across the threshold. The room was perhaps 20 feet by 18, and it held everything that mattered in a life without holding anything that did not. A fieldstone fireplace at the far wall, cast iron grate, firebox swept clean, a basket of split wood beside it, bone dry, ready. I knelt down. I lifted a piece of the wood. It was dry the way wood is dry when someone has laid it years in advance and stored it correctly. The way wood is dry when someone has thought ahead. A round oak table, 4 ladder-back chairs around it, the surface worn satin smooth by decades of use, the grain still beautiful underneath the wear. A narrow kitchen along the left wall, deep enamel sink, open shelving, a gas range from some decade when appliances were built to last. A small chest refrigerator, unplugged, standing open as it should be when a space is being properly stored. And on the shelves above the kitchen, rows of mason jars, sealed, labeled in my grandmother's handwriting. I walked over, I read them. Blueberry preserves, 2007. Applesauce, 2008. Green beans, 2007. Dried chamomile, 2009. The last label was 2009, the year she stopped coming. I touched the glass of one of the jars. The seal was still tight, the label still legible. She had written each one with the care of a woman who expected the labels to be read, who intended them to mean something, to someone. Eventually, I turned. The right wall held a built-in bookshelf, floor to ceiling, filled with paperbacks and hardcovers organized by some quiet logic novels together, field guides together, poetry together. The spines faded, readable, the whole arrangement carrying the character of a library assembled over decades. Beside the bookshelf, a small writing desk, a ladder-back chair pulled up to it, and on the desk weighted down by a smooth gray riverstone of the kind my grandmother had always brought home from creek beds, a white envelope. My name on the front, her handwriting, the letters larger and more deliberate than her usual script. The letters of a woman writing something she intended to be found, intended to be kept, intended to last. I did not open it immediately. I know how strange that sounds, but I had been raised, in some wordless way, by a woman who understood that certain moments deserved to be entered slowly, and I felt her in the room around me as clearly as I felt the cold, and I listened to her. I lit the fire first. The wood caught on the third match, bone dry, as if it had been laid by someone who knew the person coming would need it to light easily and would not have the patience for difficulty. The fieldstone hearth drew beautifully. The flame climbed clean and steady. The first crackle of wood giving its heat was the most consoling sound I had heard in months. I found a camp stove under the kitchen sink, a kettle beside it. I found chamomile tea in a sealed tin. I heated water. I made tea. I wrapped both hands around the mug, a different mug, a stoneware mug that had been left on a shelf, not a mug I had ever seen before, and I stood by the fire until some of the cold left my bones. Then I sat down at the round table. I lifted the river stone from the envelope. I opened my grandmother's letter. Linnea, if you are reading this, something you loved has broken, and the breaking has cost you more than you were prepared to lose. I know that without being there, because I know you. I know the way you love fully, without the armor that most people put on before they open themselves to someone. You have always loved that way. From the time you were a child, it is your best quality and your most dangerous one, and I have prayed for you because of it since you were small enough to hold. I want to tell you about this place before I tell you about anything else, because the place is the foundation of everything that follows. I bought this land in June of 1975. I was 39 years old. I stopped reading. I read the sentence again. I bought this land in June of 1975. I was 39 years old. She was 39. Iam forte. She bought this land at 39 with her own money, with money she had saved for 9 years before that, which meant she had begun to save the money when she was 30, which meant she had been planning something quietly without telling anyone, without ever telling me since she was younger than I am now. I kept reading. I bought it with money I had saved over 9 years. I saved that money in an account my husband did not know existed. Your grandfather was not a bad man. I want you to know that clearly. But he was a man of his time, which meant that he believed, genuinely and without malice, that money his wife earned was money he managed. I disagreed with that belief. I simply disagreed with it quietly for 9 years. While the account grew, in June of 1975, I bought 93 acres on the western shore of Lake Halvern in my name alone, through a real estate attorney in Brevard who I had researched carefully and who I trusted. The deed was recorded at the County Register of Deeds on June 17th, 1975. I paid cash. There has never been a mortgage on this land. There has never been a lien. No one in the family has ever known the full extent of what I own here, because I kept that information to myself, and I will explain why. The cabin I had built in the summer of 1976 with the help of a carpenter named Josiah Drummond and his 2 sons. They were skilled men, respectful of the land and of me. It took 1 full summer. I have loved it every day since. I set the letter down. I looked around the cabin, the fire, the mason jars, the bookshelf, the desk, the chair I was sitting in. She had built all of this. A woman in her 30s, with 9 years of secretly saved money, had built this. I picked the letter back up. Now, Linnea, I need you to understand what this property actually is, because the family has a version of it in their heads that I allowed them to keep. The cabin sits on 93 acres. 31 of those acres are lakefront, running the full length of the western shore of Lake Halvern. The lake has no state-managed public access on its western side. There is no public boat launch. There is no public access point. Every property on the eastern shore, there are 12 of them, all developed since 1985, all purchased at mountain lake prices by people who wanted exactly this kind of water, requires an easement route through my land in order to access the lake for swimming, kayaking, and boat launch. In 2002, with the help of an attorney named August Halloway, I renegotiated all 12 easement agreements. Under those agreements, each of the 12 Eastern Shore properties pays a quarterly easement access fee to the Ottilie Ashford Trust. That trust was established in 1987. It has been funded by those easement fees and by certain investment returns since 1989. The trust has operated continuously and without interruption. The current balance of the trust, as of the most recent quarterly statement, which you will find in the wooden box beneath the writing desk, is $312,000. I read the number again. $312,000 in a trust in my grandmother's name, funded by easement fees from 12 lakefront properties on a lake nobody in my family had ever bothered to look at twice. I felt the room move slightly. I kept reading because the letter was not finished. But that is not what I most need you to know. In the wooden box beneath the trust statement, you will find a sealed file from the County Register of Deeds and a letter from James Halloway, August's son, who now runs the firm on Main Street in Crestwick. James has been expecting you. He will be ready when you are ready. I lowered the letter. I sat at the table. The fire crackled in the fireplace behind me. The cabin around me was warm now. The cold had retreated from the corners. The smell of cedar and lavender and wood smoke filled the room. And I sat at the table, and I understood very clearly that I had walked into something that had been waiting for me for a very long time. I picked up the letter. There was more. I sealed that file in October of 2019, 6 months after a man came to see me here at this cabin. He came on a Tuesday morning, uninvited. He presented himself as a commercial real estate professional with an interest in lakefront development opportunities in the Western County. He was charming. He was patient. He poured himself coffee from my pot without being asked. He sat at this same table where you are sitting now, and he talked about the market and the mountains with the ease of a man who has spent his career understanding what things are worth and acquiring them. His name was Ransom Carrington. I stopped breathing. I read the sentence again. His name was Ransom Carrington. I read it a third time. He had been here. He had come here. He had driven the same gravel road I had driven that afternoon. He had climbed the same porch steps. He had sat in this same room, at this same table. He had poured my grandmother's coffee. I could not finish the thought. The letter continued. I forced my eyes back to it. I told him the property was not available, had never been, and would not be. He said that all property is available at the right price. I asked him to leave. He left. But on his way off the porch, he paused at the door, and he said something I want to tell you exactly. He said, "You're getting older, Mrs. Nataway, not eventually." I stood at this window. I watched him drive away. And then I called James Halloway. I felt something in my chest go cold. Not the cold of fear, the cold of clarity. The cold of a woman who has been looking at a puzzle for a very long time, and who has just been given the missing piece, and who can now see all at once what the picture has been the whole time. He had known about this land. He had known its value. He had known what it was worth. He had known what it represented. He had known all of that before he married me. I read the rest of the letter. I had already updated my estate plan 3 times since establishing the trust. I updated it once more in October of 2019 with instructions that could not be misread. Everything, the 93 acres, the cabin, the trust, every document in this house has been yours in trust since October 28th, 2019. You could not claim it before my death. But I am gone now, and you are reading this, and it is yours. All of it, irrevocably and completely yours. He knew about this land, Linnea. He came here and he sat at my table and he tried to buy it. He knew its value. He knew what it was worth in the market and what it represented as lakefront acreage in a region where that kind of land is increasingly rare. He knew all of that before he married you. I want you to think carefully about what that means. Beneath the writing desk, there is a loose floorboard. The one that always creaked under your right foot when you sat here as a child and drew your pictures. You remember it. Lift it. Everything you need is in the wooden box. I love you without limit or condition across every year and every mile and everything that stands between us now. Your Grandma Audley. I set the letter down. I did not move for a long time. The fire crackled. The cabin was warm. Outside, somewhere on the lake, a single loon called once and then was silent. I tried to think. I could not think. I could only see one thing. Ransom. In this cabin. At this table. Pouring coffee. Telling my 83-year-old grandmother that all property is available at the right price. Standing on her porch. Telling her that she was getting older. That these things have a way of working out. He had said that to her. He had said that to her while we were married, while I was at home in Asheville, probably sourcing a brass hinge from a salvage yard in Georgia. He had been planning this for years. I stood up. The room tilted. I steadied myself on the back of the chair. I waited for the tilting to stop. Then I crossed to the writing desk. I knelt. I felt along the floor with my hand. My right foot, even as I knelt, remembered the give of the floorboard before my conscious mind did, the body's memory being older, more reliable than the mind's. I found it. The board was slightly loose at one edge. I lifted. It came up cleanly on a small hidden hinge. Below it, a flat pine box, brass latch. I lifted the box out. I set it on the desk. I opened it. Inside, a bank statement envelope from First Mountain Trust in Crestwick, sealed. A legal-sized envelope stamped with the County Register of Deeds seal, sealed, notarized. A cardstock envelope with the letterhead of Halloway and Halloway, with a handwritten note clipped to the front in ink that looked recent. Open when ready. We have been expecting you. James Halloway. And at the bottom of the box, a single photograph printed on plain paper. I picked it up. It showed the interior of a county office, a desk, a computer, folders on a shelf behind. Standing at the desk was a man I could have identified in any light, at any distance, in any context, because I had been married to him for 12 years and had studied his face with the attention that love at its best brings to whatever it fixes on. Ransom. In the charcoal suit I remembered from a real estate conference he'd attended in Charlotte in the autumn of 2019. He was leaning over a spread of papers, and beside him, a man in what appeared to be a county official's uniform, pointing at something on the top page. I turned the photograph over on the back. In my grandmother's handwriting, the 14th of November, 2019. James Halloway's investigator, RC at the county assessor's office, inquiring about the Ashford Lake Halvern parcel, acreage, easement, structure, access rights, existing encumbrances. I held the photograph. I held it for a long time. He had not just come to the cabin, he had gone to the county assessor. After she turned him away, after he stood on her porch and told her these things have a way of working out, he had driven to the county seat. He had stood at a government desk. He had asked for the records. He had been looking for a legal pathway in. He had been thorough. He had been methodical. He had treated the acquisition of my grandmother's land as a project, the same way he treated commercial real estate acquisitions in Asheville, the same way he had treated, I now understood, our marriage. And on November 14th, he had been investigating my grandmother's property. On November 14th, exactly 5 years later, to the day, a judge had handed him the Carrington estate and given me 30 days to leave it. I did not believe in signs. I did not believe in fate. But I sat in that cabin in the warmth of a fire my grandmother had laid for me, holding a photograph she had filed away precisely for this moment. And I understood, with a clarity I had not felt in years, that she had not been waiting for me by accident, that every detail of what I was looking at had been built by a woman who had refused to let me face this alone. I slept in the cabin that night. I had not planned to stay. I had not planned anything beyond the drive and the door and the letter, but the fire was warm, and the narrow loft bed was made up with a quilt that smelled of cedar and lavender. And when I lay down on top of the quilt to rest my eyes for a moment, I slept for 11 hours, without dreaming. I woke to birdsong, pale November light through the loft window. For several seconds, I had the rare, clean experience of not knowing where I was. Only warmth, cedar, quiet, a quality of morning light I did not immediately recognize, because it was the light of a place I had not been in 15 years. And then I knew, and the weight of knowledge returned. But with it, and this surprised me more than anything that had come before something else, something more foundational than hope, the feeling of ground beneath your feet, after a long time spent suspended. I made coffee on the camp stove. I sat on the porch in the morning sun. I watched the lake. I needed to go into town. I needed food. I needed to call Sloan Petrov. I needed to see James Holloway. I needed to begin. I drove the gravel road back to the paved county route. I drove the county route into Crestwick. The morning sun was on the storefronts. The hardware store was open. The diner was open. I parked in front of the diner. I went next door to a small market, Whitmore's Grocery. The sign read, hand-painted, faded. A bell rang above the door when I walked in. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 70, 72. She had silver hair pulled into a low bun, a green apron over a checked shirt. She was unpacking a crate of apples. She looked up when I came in. She looked at me, and then she went very still. I did not understand the stillness. I assumed she was simply looking at a stranger who had walked into her store. I picked up a small basket. I started toward the dairy case at the back. She said, "Excuse me, honey." I turned. She had set the apple down. She came around the counter, slowly, carefully, the way an older woman moves when she has something she needs to do. She stopped about 3 feet from me. She looked at my face. The way you look at a face when you are confirming, against 30 years of imagining it, that the person in front of you is who you think they are. She said, "You're Ottilie's granddaughter, aren't you?" I felt the floor shift. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Linnea, you're Linnea." I said, "How did you—" She took another step toward me. She put her hand lightly on my arm. She said, "Honey, my name is Hattie Whitmore. Your grandmother and I were friends for 46 years. I could not speak. She said, "She talked about you every single week for 13 years, every Saturday morning. She came into this store and she had her coffee, and she told me how you were." I felt my throat close. She said you would come someday, and I have been watching this door every morning for 13 years, waiting to see what you would look like when you finally walked through it. I tried to say something. I could not. She said very softly, "Honey, sit down right here." She led me to a small wooden chair behind the counter, the kind of chair store owners keep for the elderly. She sat me down. She did not let go of my arm. She said, "Frank, honey, bring this young woman a glass of water." A man's voice from the back said, "Coming." I sat in the chair. I held Hattie Whitmore's hand. I had never met her in my life, and I held her hand the way you hold the hand of a person who has been waiting for you for 13 years. The man Frank, her husband, I would learn, brought the water. He set it on the counter. He looked at me with kind, careful eyes. He squeezed his wife's shoulder. He went back to the storeroom without speaking. Hattie said, "Tell me your name, sweetheart. I want to hear you say it." I said, "Linnea Ashford." She closed her eyes. She nodded slowly. She said, "Yes, that is exactly the name," she said. "Every time. Linnea Ashford." She opened her eyes. She looked at me. And then I cried. For the first time since November 14th, for the first time since the woman in the cashmere sweater, for the first time maybe since my grandmother had died. I sat in the back of a small grocery store in Crestwick, North Carolina, and I cried. With my hand in the hand of a 72-year-old stranger who had known my grandmother better than I had, who had been told about me every week for 13 years. Hattie did not say anything. She did not tell me it was going to be all right. She did not pat my hand. She just sat there. And she let me cry. The way you let a person cry when crying is the thing that needs to happen. After a while, I do not know how long, I stopped. She handed me a tissue from the box she kept behind the counter. She said, "She told me about the painting you did when you were 8, the one with the cardinal and the dogwood tree." I nodded. I had not thought of that painting in 30 years. She said, "She told me about the day you graduated from college. She said you walked across the stage and your face was the same face you had at 4 when she gave you the watercolors. She said she had never been so proud." I nodded again. She said, "And she told me about the day she heard you were marrying that man." I looked up. Hattie was looking at me steadily. Her green eyes were very clear. She said, "She did not like him, honey. She did not like him from the first time she heard his name." I said, "She never told me." Hattie said, "She wouldn't have. That was not how she worked. She trusted you to find your own way. She did not interfere, but she did not like him." She paused. She said, "And when he came to see her at the cabin in 2019, she came into the store the following Saturday, and she sat in this exact chair, and she told me what he had said to her on her porch about how she was getting older." I closed my eyes. Hattie said, "And then she told me, word for word, what she was going to do about it." I opened my eyes. I said, "What did she say?" Hattie said, "Hattie, he has no idea who he just met." I sat with that for a long moment. The store was very quiet around us. Outside on Main Street, a truck went by. A door opened somewhere. A radio in the back played softly. I said, "She built it all for me." Hattie said, "She built it for you, sweetheart. She built it knowing you might never need it. And she built it knowing you might. And she kept building, right up until the end." I said, "How did she know?" Hattie said, "Know what?" I said, "That I would need it, that it would happen." Hattie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Honey, your grandmother was a woman who had lived a long time and had seen what happens to women who love completely, who do not have an exit. She built you an exit. She did not know you would need it. She knew it was possible. And possible was enough for her." I drove back to the cabin in the early afternoon. The lake was lit up by November sun. The cabin sat on its rise like a thing that had been quietly waiting through one more morning to see if I was still there. I climbed the porch steps. I went inside. I sat at the round table. I opened the cardstock envelope from Holloway and Holloway. The note inside was brief. "Miss Ashford, please come to the office at your convenience. We can meet today or tomorrow. We have been holding the file for you. Respectfully, James Holloway." I drove back into Crestwick the next morning. The Holloway and Holloway office was in the small Victorian building I had noted my first afternoon. I pushed through the door. The receptionist looked up. The expression on her face was the same expression Hattie's had been. The expression of someone who has been told to watch for a particular person and is confirming that the person has finally arrived. James Halloway was 71, silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the unhurried, deliberate manner of a man who had spent his career in rooms where words have consequences and precision is the highest form of respect. He rose when I entered. He shook my hand with both of his. He said, "Miss Ashford, I have been waiting a long time to meet you." He walked me through it, carefully, document by document. The 93 acres, held in the Audley Ashford Revocable Trust since 1987, converting to irrevocable status upon her death. I was the sole named beneficiary. The property could not be sold, transferred, mortgaged, or encumbered without my written consent. He set a single document in front of me, a certified property appraisal dated July of the previous year, commissioned by his office in anticipation of the trust's activation. He folded his hands. He said, "Miss Ashford, the appraisal." I said yes. He said the 93 acres, given the lakefront footage, the 31 acres of direct lake frontage on the western shore, the existing easement income, the current mountain lake real estate market, and the development potential of the upper 62 acres which have never been assessed at their true value because your grandmother saw no reason to attract that kind of attention. He paused. He looked at me over his glasses. He said appraised at $4,200,000. I sat in the chair across from him. I did not say anything. He let the silence sit. Then he said, "The trust balance stands at $312,000 as of this month, including the most recent quarterly easement deposit. All assets transfer to you, without probate, without encumbrance, and without any contested claim." He paused again. He said, "Miss Ashford, your grandmother established something here that she spent 50 years protecting. I have been honored to be part of that protection. I am more honored to hand it to you." I said, "She told you about Ransom?" He nodded. He said, "She called me the morning after he came to the cabin. I want you to know she was not frightened. Not in the least. She was precise. She wanted the visit documented, dated, notarized. She authorized our investigator to follow his subsequent inquiry at the assessor's office. She filed a notarized affidavit of that visit with this office in November of 2019, which has been sealed since that date." He placed his hand on the folder between us. He said, "Every document in here was assembled by your grandmother for a specific purpose, to ensure that what she built could not be taken from you, and that if someone tried, you would have the means to respond." I drove back to the cabin that evening. Through the mountain dark, I sat by the fire until it burned down to orange coals, and I thought about the shape of what she had done, not just the legal precision of it, the trust, the documents, the investigator, the notarized affidavit, but the depth of understanding behind it. She had looked at her own life, at my mother's life, at mine, and she had seen the pattern, the women in our family who loved with their whole selves, and gave that love to people and situations that did not always protect them. And she had decided 50 years ago, beginning with 9 years of quiet saving in an account her own husband did not know existed, to build something that could not be taken, something that waited, something that would be there at the end of the road. When the women who came after her had been told there was no road left, she had built it with her own hands, her own money, her own extraordinary foresight. She had held it in trust across 5 decades, and she had left it to me at the exact moment I needed it, not one moment before. I called Sloan Petrov the next morning. Sloan is the kind of attorney who listens without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. I told her everything: the letter, the property, the trust, the photograph at the assessor's office, James Halloway, the sealed file, Hattie Whitmore. She was quiet for several seconds when I finished. Then she said, "Linnea, I need you to listen to me carefully." I said, "Yes." She said, "What you have just described is not only grounds to reopen the settlement." She paused. She said, "What you have just described is fraud upon the court." She explained it. Ransom had conducted documented active investigation of a significant family asset during our marriage. He had engaged an investigator. He had used his own professional knowledge to assess the property's value and legal structure. He had visited the property in person. He had attempted to acquire it. He had then certified as required under North Carolina family law that he had disclosed all relevant financial relationships and interests in the divorce proceedings. His failure to disclose his knowledge of the Lake Halvern property, his knowledge of a $4 million asset connected to me by clear family relationship, while simultaneously certifying complete financial disclosure, constituted material misrepresentation to the court. In plain terms, Sloan said he lied to the judge. He lied to the court. He lied in writing, under oath, about his knowledge of your financial circumstances. That is not a technicality, Linnea. That is fraud. She paused. She said, "And I can prove it." The motion to reopen was filed in December. The discovery process was contested. Ransom's attorneys fought with the full energy and expense of people who understood that the stakes had changed substantially. But they were fighting against a paper record assembled by a woman who had spent 50 years being more careful than anyone around her. James Halloway's investigator file, the notarized affidavit from October 2019, the assessor's office documentation, the photograph, and them. In the third week of discovery, Sloan's team subpoenaed the email archive from Ransom's commercial real estate firm. Caspian Voss had not anticipated this angle. He had prepared to defend against the property documents. He had not prepared for the internal correspondence of a man who had been conducting business under the assumption that his private communications were private. Sloan called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was at the cabin. I had built a fire. I was sitting at the round table. The lake outside the window was beginning to skim with ice at the edges. She said, "Linnea." I said, "Yes." She said, "I just got something from the discovery team. I want to read it to you." I said, "All right." She said, "The email is dated August of 2021, 18 months before he filed for divorce. It was addressed to his business partner, a man named Russell Vane." I closed my eyes. She read it. "The Carrington estate is the clean exit. It's in my name. The documentation is straightforward, and the division will be simple. The Ashford Lake situation is going to need separate handling once the marital estate is resolved. I've confirmed the property is held in trust for L, but the trust activates on the grandmother's death, and she's 85. We'll have more options in a year or two." I did not say anything. Sloan was quiet. After a moment, she said, "Linnea, are you there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "This is everything we needed, and more." I hung up the phone. I stood up from the table. I walked outside, across the cabin, clearing, down to the lake. The afternoon light was beginning to fail. The mountains across the water were going dark blue. A cold wind moved across the surface of the lake. I stood at the water's edge. The Ashford Lake situation, the marital estate, options in a year or two. He had been planning the divorce 18 months before he filed. While I was sourcing brass hinges in Lynchburg, while I was stripping paint from crown molding, while I was telling myself that the absence of his attention was the natural texture of a marriage, he had been calculating the separation of assets, identifying the Lake Halvern property by name, understanding its trust structure, assessing the timeline of my grandmother's death, making strategic decisions based on all of it. I stood at the water for a long time. I did not cry. The crying was done. What remained, finally, was something else. Something my grandmother had been quietly building toward in me my whole life, without ever once telling me what it was she was building. I walked back up the slope to the cabin. The fire was still burning. The light from the window made a warm yellow square against the gray afternoon. I went inside. I closed the door behind me. I sat at the table. I picked up my grandmother's letter. I read the last paragraph again. I love you, without limit or condition, across every year and every mile, and everything that stands between us now. Your Grandma Ottilie. I folded the letter. I placed it back beneath the river stone. Sloane's pre-trial conference was scheduled for January in a small wood-paneled room in the Ashford County Courthouse, the same courthouse I had walked out of in November, with $43 and the legal death certificate of my marriage and a brass key in my pocket I had not yet understood. I would understand it now. The pretrial conference took place on a Thursday morning in January, the same courthouse, the same parking lot, the same wind off the mountains that had cut through me on November 14th. Except, this time, I was not alone. Sloane Petrov met me on the steps. She was wearing a charcoal suit. She had a leather folio under her arm. She looked at me the way generals must look at soldiers before a battle that has already been decided in their favor and is now simply a matter of seeing it through. She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You don't have to speak today, not unless you want to." I said, "I know." She said, "But Linnea," I looked at her. She said, "If you want to, you can." I nodded. I had thought about it, but I had brought one sentence with me, just in case. We walked into the courthouse together. The small conference room had a long mahogany table, 8 chairs, a pitcher of water in the center, a single window looking out over the parking lot. The kind of room where things are decided that change the shape of people's lives, without ceremony, without spectacle, just paper, and pens, and the careful precision of attorneys who have prepared. Ransom was already there. He was wearing a suit I had never seen, dark blue, new, the shoulders not quite right. I knew his suits the way you know any garment that has spent 12 years in a closet you also use. This one had been bought recently by someone who was buying things now. He did not look at me when I walked in. Caspian Voss was beside him. Caspian had a folder open. He looked tired. The careful smile he had worn through 14 months of proceedings was gone. In its place was the expression of a man who had been hired to defend a position and had just discovered that the position was not defensible. I sat across from Ransom. Sloane sat beside me. She opened her folio. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she lifted out a single sheet of paper. She placed it, face up, in the center of the table. The email, August 2021, to Russell Vane. I watched Ransom's eyes move to the paper. I watched them stop. I watched his face do the thing that faces do when they have just understood fully, without the possibility of revision, that the ground beneath the plans is not what was believed. It was not dramatic. It was not the collapse of a man who suddenly breaks. The change was quieter than that and more complete. The expression of a man who has just run the calculation and found that the outcome he designed is no longer available. Sloane did not press the moment. She did not need to. She let the email sit where it was. She said, in the measured, unhurried voice she used when the facts were doing all the necessary work, "We believe a renegotiated settlement is in everyone's interest. We would like to begin that conversation today." Caspian Voss did not look at the email. He looked at his client. He waited. Ransom did not speak. Caspian said very carefully, "Counsel, I would like to request a brief recess to confer with my client." Sloane said, "Of course." The two men stood. They left the room. The door closed behind them. The room was very quiet. Sloane looked at me. She raised an eyebrow. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. She said, "You all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "He didn't say a word." I said, "No?" She said, 12 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "And he didn't say a single word." I looked at the email on the table. I said, "He didn't need to. He never did." We waited 14 minutes. I timed it on the clock on the wall. Then the door opened. Caspian came back in alone. He sat down. He folded his hands. He said, "My client would like a moment with Mrs. Ashford alone. If she is willing." Sloane looked at me. She did not speak. She let it be my decision. I thought about it. For one full second, I said, "Yes." Sloane said, "Linnea." I said, "It's all right. 5 minutes." Caspian nodded. He stood. He stepped out of the room and gestured for Sloane to follow him. She gave me a look, a steady, careful look, and she followed. The door closed. I sat alone at the table. A moment later, the door opened again. Ransom came in. He shut the door behind him. He did not sit down. He stood at the far end of the table with his hands in his pockets, the way he stood at parties, the way he stood when he was about to be charming, except he was not charming. He looked at me. I looked back. He said, "Linnea." I did not answer. He said, "I want to talk to you." I said, "I'm here." He said, "I never meant for it to go this way." I said nothing. He said, "The things in that email, they were strategy. They weren't." He stopped. He started again. He said, "They weren't what I felt about you." I waited. He said, "I loved you, Linnea." I waited. He said, I did. I did love you." I waited. He said, "What we had." I said, "Stop." He stopped. I said, "You don't get to do that." He said, "Do what?" I said, "Reach for a sentence about what you felt to soften the email on the table." He said, "Linnea." I said, "Don't." He said, I said, "Don't." He stopped. We looked at each other across the length of the table. And then, because he was a man who could not finally stop himself, he said the thing. He said, "Who do you think you are?" Just that, in a voice that was not angry, in a voice that was something worse than angry, a voice that was bewildered, genuinely bewildered. The voice of a man who had spent 12 years thinking he understood the categories, who had assigned me a category, and who was watching the category fail in front of him and could not understand why. He said it again. "Who do you think you are to be sitting here with this?" He gestured at the email. He said, how did you, this isn't." He stopped. He said, "You weren't supposed to," and he stopped because he had heard himself. I looked at him. I felt something inside me settle. The sentence I had been carrying, the one I had thought about the night before at the cabin, while the fire burned down, while the stars came out over the lake, the sentence that had been forming in me for months, without my knowing it. I let it come out. I said very quietly, "I am the granddaughter of a woman who saw me long before you ever tried not to. He stared at me. I said, she built me a door, Ransom. You came to her house. You sat at her table. You drank her coffee. And you told her she was getting older. You stood on her porch. And you told her that these things have a way of working out. I paused. I said, she was 83 years old, and she had been waiting her whole life for a man like you to walk in and underestimate her. He did not speak. I said, she built me a door, and I walked through it, and you are not on the other side. I stood up. I picked up my folio. I walked to the door. I opened it. I did not look back at him. The renegotiation took 6 weeks. It was not, in the end, a courtroom drama. The drama had ended at the conference table, with the email on the mahogany, with the man at the far end of the room, who had not been able to finish a sentence. It became a paper exercise after that. Sloane's team, Caspian's team, lines of correspondence, numbers moving back and forth. The original settlement reopened. The fraud findings entered into the record. The Carrington estate reassessed, revalued, redivided. I did not want the house. I want you to understand that. I did not want the Carrington estate. I did not want to walk back into those rooms to touch the crown molding I had stripped, the brass window latches I had carried home from Lynchburg in the back of my sedan, the heart pine I had uncovered weekend by weekend. I did not want any of it. What I wanted was for the law to acknowledge on paper, in writing, with a number attached, that my 6 years of work had not been decoration. The settlement gave me 60% of the estate's reassessed market value. It is not the highest number Sloane could have pushed for. I told her to stop pushing. She looked at me. She nodded. She understood. The number was not the point. The number was the receipt. The receipt was the point. I signed the final renegotiated agreement on a Friday afternoon in early March in Sloane's office in Asheville, with sunlight coming through the window and a small vase of yellow tulips on her desk that her paralegal had brought in that morning. I signed my name, Linnea Ashford. Sloane signed below me. I closed the folder. I sat for a moment. Sloane said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I don't know yet." She said, "That's all right." I said, "I think I will know. When I get back to the cabin," she said, Go home." I had not heard her use that word. Home. I sat in her office for one more second. Then I picked up my bag. I walked out of her office. I walked down the stairs. I got in my car. I drove west. The snow was almost gone from the foothills by then. The hardwoods were still bare, but the willows along the creeks were yellowing at their tips, the first hint of green coming back into the world. I drove the county road, the gravel track, the 2-track through hemlock and rhododendron. I came around the last bend. The cabin sat on its rise. Smoke was coming from the chimney. I had banked the fire that morning before I left. The smoke meant the embers had caught the next log I had set at the edge. The cabin had been warming itself. Waiting, I drove up to the clearing. I parked. I got out. I walked across the dry grass. I climbed the porch. The cabin was warm when I opened the door. The fire was alive in the hearth. The afternoon light through the western window was the color of old gold. I closed the door behind me. I leaned my back against it. I stood there for a long time, and then, for no reason I could have named, he began to laugh. Not loud, not hysterical. A low, quiet, surprised laugh. The laugh of a woman who has just understood something about her own life after waiting a very long time to understand it. I laughed, and then I cried, and then I laughed again, and then I sat down on the rug in front of the fire, and I put my face in my hands, and I let it all come out. When it stopped, I got up. I went to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I made tea. I went and sat at the round table. The river stone was there, where I had left it, on top of my grandmother's letter. I lifted the stone. I read the letter again, the way I had read it 40 times by then, the way I would read it 40 more. I love you, without limit or condition, across every year and every mile. I folded the letter. I placed the stone back on top of it. I sat at the table. I drank my tea. Outside the window, the lake was blue and very still. Spring came to Lake Halvern in the slow, half-believing way that spring comes to the Blue Ridge. One day the trees were bare. The next day the willows were soft yellow. Then the redbuds opened along the south-facing slopes, pale lavender against the gray hillsides. The ice melted from the lake in late March, in April. Delphine Brooks came across the water. She came in a small wooden rowboat, painted dark green. She rowed it the way a woman who has been rowing for 30 years rows a boat with no wasted motion, with her shoulders square, her white hair tied back in a low knot. I was on the dock when she came. I had been mending the railing. Boyd Drummond, the grandson, it turned out, of the carpenter who had built the cabin in 1976, had been out the previous week to look at the dock. He had pointed out the boards that needed replacing. He had laid new boards the following day. The dock smelled like new lumber and lake water and spring. Delphine rowed up to the end of the dock. She looked up at me from the boat. She said, "Linnea Ashford." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am Delphine Brooks. I live in the red-roofed house on the East Shore. I knew your grandmother for 30 years. I said, Hattie told me about you." She smiled, the smile of an older woman, a face that had earned every line on it. She said, "May I come up?" I said, "Yes, please." She tied her boat. She climbed the ladder. She was 68 years old. She climbed the ladder like a woman who climbed ladders. She stood on the dock in jeans and a flannel shirt and a green wool sweater. She looked at me. She said, "I have been waiting 13 years to meet you." I said, "I know." She said, "Your grandmother told me you would come someday." She did not know when. I said, "Neither did I." Delphine looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "She told me a granddaughter might come, and if you came, I should help you." I said, "I would like that." She said, "Then let us go up to the cabin, and I will tell you what I know." We sat at the round table. I made coffee. Delphine wrapped her hands around the mug. She looked around the cabin. She said, "She kept it the same." I said, "Yes." She said, "She had it shuttered after 2010. She could not make the drive up anymore. Her knees, her back, the roads, but she could not bear to sell it. So I told her, oddly, I will check on it. I will check on it every season. I will make sure the roof is sound and the shutters are tight and the pipes are drained for winter." She paused. She said, she let me. She said, "Delphine, if you do this for me, you do it knowing that you may be doing it for a long time, and you may be doing it for someone who never comes." I said, "And you did it anyway." Delphine said, "I did it. For 13 years, I came over in October to drain the pipes. I came in April to check the foundation. I came in July to clear the brush back from the porch. I came in November to make sure the shutters had not loosened in the autumn winds." She paused. She said, "I did it because I loved her, and because she had loved me when I had needed loving after my husband died. She came over here in her rowboat, and she sat with me on the porch of the red-roofed house for 3 afternoons in a row. And she did not tell me it was going to be all right. She just sat with me, Um, until the worst of the first week was over, she looked at me. She said, "That is what your grandmother did, Linnea. She sat with women who needed sitting with. She built things that needed building, and she held doors open for people who did not know yet that they were going to walk through them." I did not say anything. I could not. Delphine reached across the table. She placed her hand on top of mine. She said, "Honey, the studio." I said, "The what?" She said, "Behind the cabin. Did she tell you about the studio?" I said, "No." Delphine stood up. She walked to the back door of the cabin. She opened it. She held it open. She said, "Come." I followed her. 20 yards behind the cabin, tucked into the slope of the hill, almost invisible from the cabin itself, hidden by white pines and rhododendron, was a small outbuilding I had not noticed. I had been at the cabin for almost 5 months. I had not seen it. It was set so carefully into the landscape, so intentionally, that it looked less like a building than like a part of the hillside that had developed a roof. The roof was metal, mossed at the edges, a single chimney pipe, a door painted the same dark gray-green as the hillside it sat against. Delphine walked to the door. She lifted the latch. The door was not locked. She turned to me. She said, "Linnea, there is something here she did not tell you about because she wanted you to find it without the weight of expectation." She opened the door. She stepped aside. The studio had north-facing light. The whole far wall was glass, a long bank of windows looking out over the slope of the hill into a stand of old pines. The light coming through it was the cold, clear light of Northlight, painter's light. The light artists spend their lives trying to find. The room smelled of linseed oil and old paper and cedar. Inside, a long work table along the south wall, a wooden easel set in the center of the floor, two more easels folded against the far wall, a wood stove, a small chair with a wool blanket folded over its back, and on every other wall, and in racks against the back wall, and stacked in careful piles on a low shelf, paintings, hundreds of paintings, hundreds. I stopped. I did not move. Delphine stayed in the doorway behind me. She let me look. I walked forward, slowly. The way you walk when you have just stepped into a place that you did not know existed and that you understand without having to be told is going to change something in you. The paintings nearest the door were small, studies, landscape studies of the lake in every season, in every light, morning, evening, winter, summer, the water at every hour of every day of every month of decades. I moved deeper into the room. Larger paintings hung on the walls, a field of goldenrod in October, the light slanted, specific. A barred owl perched on the dead branch of a sycamore, the eyes precise, the feathers rendered with the kind of attention that takes years to learn. A view from this very window, looking out into the pines, the light coming through the trees in long horizontal bars. I reached the back wall, the racks. I touched the edge of one of the canvases carefully. The way you touch something that you understand is precious. I pulled one out, a portrait, a woman, mid-40s, sitting in a chair, her face turned 3/4 to the viewer, her hands folded in her lap. I knew the face. I had seen it in old photographs, in albums, on my grandmother's mantle. It was my grandmother in her mid-40s, painted by my grandmother. In her mid-40s, a self-portrait, done, the way self-portraits are done, by people who are willing to look at themselves. Truly. I pulled out another, my grandmother. At 50, another, my grandmother. At 60, another, my grandmother. At 70, a series, a record, decade by decade, of a woman painting herself without vanity, without sentimentality, with the absolute clear-eyed honesty of someone who had decided that her own face was worth witnessing. In the lower right corner of every canvas, small, consistent, Ova Ottilie Vivienne Ashford. I sat down on the wooden floor of the studio. I did not mean to. My legs simply gave way. I sat down, with my hands still on the edge of the canvas, and I put my forehead against the back of the chair that had been her chair. And I cried for the second time in 12 hours. Delphine came in. She sat down on the floor beside me. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, she started painting at 38. She taught herself from library books and stubbornness and the willingness to be bad at something for long enough to become good. I nodded. I could not speak. Delphine said, she sold a few pieces over the years, through a gallery in Asheville, under a pseudonym. She did not want the name to do the work the painting should do. She gave all the proceeds to a women's legal aid organization in Buncombe County. I closed my eyes. I leaned my head against the chair. I said, why did she not tell anyone? Delphine said, she told me, and she told a gallery owner, and she told a tax accountant in Asheville. That was it. I said, why? Delphine was quiet. Then she said, because she said, the painting was the part of her life. That was only hers, not her husband's, not her daughter's, not her granddaughter's, hers. And she was not going to give it to anyone who had not earned the seeing of it. She paused. She said, I think she was waiting to see if you would earn it. I opened my eyes. I looked at her. She looked back. She said, and here you are. I called Cordelia Marsh that evening. Cordelia is an art appraiser I had worked with in Asheville for years before my marriage. She has the temperament of a careful surgeon, the eye of a museum conservator, and the absolute professional honesty that the best appraisers have. She drove up the following Saturday. When the gravel road was passable, she spent a full day in the studio. She moved through the racks slowly. The way she moves through any collection she is taking seriously. She did not speak. She made small notes in a green notebook. She lifted some pieces out and set them in the north light to look at them. She put them back carefully. She picked up another. At the end of the day, she came to the round table in the cabin. She sat down. I made her coffee. She said, Linnea. I said, yes. She said, I want to be conservative. I said, all right. She said, some of these will need provenance work and additional expert assessment before I can be confident about specific figures. But conservatively, I am looking at $80,000 to $100,000 in sellable inventory. I said, conservatively. She said, and there are at least 3 pieces that I believe could do substantially better with proper placement. And the right context. She paused. She said, Linnea? I said, yes. She said, who was she? I said, she was my grandmother. Cordelia looked at me. Then she looked toward the studio door. She said she was very good. She was genuinely, seriously good. You can see it in the work, the confidence in the later pieces, the authority. She paused. She said this was not a hobby. I said, no, it wasn't. The exhibition opened in early summer. I curated it myself in a small gallery on Lexington Avenue. 2 doors down from the gallery where I had been working the night I met Ransom. 12 years before, I selected 18 pieces. I chose them carefully, the way she would have chosen them. I titled the exhibition Things We Choose for Ourselves. The paintings of Ottilie Vivienne Ashford, 1976, 2019. The opening was on a Friday evening in June. The mountain air was warm, but not yet hot. The gallery had its doors open. People came in off the street. Hattie Whitmore drove down from Crestwick. She wore her best dress, a pale blue Sunday dress. She brought Frank. He wore a sport coat. They held hands the whole evening. Delphine came in a green silk blouse. Boyd Drummond came with his wife. They stood in front of the largest piece for almost 20 minutes without speaking. James Halloway came in a dark suit. He nodded at me from across the room when he saw me. He did not need to say anything. Sloane Petrov came. She brought her wife. They had been married for 16 years. They stood at the wine table together. Sloane caught my eye. She smiled. And a group of women came down from Crestwick. A group I had not seen before. Hattie's friends, the Thursday morning women, the women who met every Thursday at the back of Whitmore's grocery to drink coffee and eat the lemon scones Hattie baked on Wednesdays and to talk. They came in together, 8 of them, all between 60 and 75. They wore their best cardigans, their best earrings, the lipsticks they saved for special occasions. They moved through the gallery slowly. They stopped in front of every painting. When they reached the self-portraits, Ottilie at 40, Ottilie at 50, Ottilie at 60, Ottilie at 70, they stood there for a long time, quietly, looking. And one by one, they began to cry. A woman in a violet cardigan put her hand to her mouth. Another, in pearl earrings she had clearly inherited from her own mother, lowered her head. The woman beside her put an arm around her shoulders. They stood together in front of the portrait of a woman they had known without knowing, the fullest version of. I watched them from across the gallery, and I understood that what my grandmother had done with these paintings, with this long, patient, half-century practice of looking at herself and refusing to lie about what she saw. What she had done was she had left a record for women like these, for women who had spent their lives being looked at without being seen. She had left them a record of what it looks like to see yourself completely, to make the seeing of yourself a discipline. I crossed the gallery. I went to the women in front of the portraits. I introduced myself. They held my hands. They told me their names. They told me how they had known Ottilie. The Saturday mornings at Whitmore's, the afternoons on Delphine's porch, the funeral in March, which I had not been able to attend, because I had been in the early hopeless months of trying to save a marriage I had not yet understood was already lost. I told them I was sorry I had not been there. The woman in the violet cardigan put her hand on my cheek. She said, "Honey, you are here now." I sold 5 paintings that evening. I had not planned to sell anything. I had planned only to show. But people came to me, quietly, privately. They asked. I sold 3 to private collectors who promised to lend them out for future exhibitions. I sold 2 to a regional museum that had heard about the show and sent a curator on opening night. The proceeds from those 5 paintings paid for the rewiring of the cabin and the new dock that Boyd Drummond would build me that summer, and the materials for the studio repairs. I kept the rest of the paintings. I will keep them, I think, for as long as I live. In late summer, I established the Ottilie Vivienne Ashford Foundation. It is a small foundation funded by a portion of the quarterly easement income from the lake properties and by the proceeds of the gallery sales when I choose to sell. The foundation provides modest grants to women over the age of 40 who are returning to professional life after divorce or widowhood, or the long pause of caregiving, or any of the other reasons women find themselves at the beginning of something. When the world expects them to be at the end of it, I run it from the cabin. James Holloway's firm handles the legal work. Hattie Whitmore is on the board of directors. So is Delphine, so is Sloan. We meet once a month at the cabin, around the round oak table. We pour coffee, we read applications, we argue gently, we choose. We have given out 14 grants in the first year. A woman in Hendersonville is using her grant to finish a nursing certification she started 30 years ago. A woman in Marion is using hers to buy materials for a quilt-making business she has been wanting to start since her husband died. A woman in Silva is using hers to take a master's class in landscape design she could not otherwise afford. The grants are small, 3,000, 5,000, sometimes 7. The grants are not the point. The point is that women over 40 with dreams they had been told it was too late for. Open envelopes with our letterhead at the top and read the words, "You have been awarded." The point is the receipt. The receipt is the point. In the early morning of a Saturday in April of the following year, I dragged the old aluminum canoe down to the water. The ice was fully off the lake. The rhododendrons along the eastern shore were just beginning to open, the pink of them still tentative, testing the air. I pushed off from the dock. I paddled out into the mist. The mountains rose on 3 sides. The pines stood dark on the ridges. The new dock was pale and fresh at the water's edge below the cabin's rise. The studio window was visible through the tree line, catching the first angle of morning light. The chimney held a thin line of smoke from the stove I had banked. I rested the paddle across my knees. I breathed. She had bought this land at 39 years old. With 9 years of quietly saved money, she had built the cabin with her own earnings. She had managed it, protected it, developed it. Over 5 decades, she had kept its true extent hidden from everyone who might have handled it carelessly. She had hired an attorney, structured a trust, commissioned an investigation, filed a notarized affidavit, updated her estate plan 6 times, the last time at 83 years old, because a man had come to her table and said, "These things have a way of working out eventually." And she had looked at him and understood exactly what he meant and taken the steps to make sure he was wrong. And then she had died, holding that knowledge, and left the key and the letter and the wooden box in a sealed cabin on a mountain lake where I would find them at the moment I was able to use them. The mist was burning off the water. I picked up the paddle. I began to move across the quiet morning surface, toward the shore, toward the dock and the cabin and the studio in the north light. And the work and the women and the foundation and the round table where on Thursday evening Hattie would come for dinner, and on Monday morning I would open the new applications for the next quarter. A heron stood at the near end of the dock. In the absolute ancient stillness only herons have, he watched me come in. I beached the canoe. I climbed up to the cabin. I stood on the porch for a moment, looking out over the lake. I said, out loud, into the morning air, "I am home, Grandma." I said it. Once, I went inside. The fire was warm. The kettle was on. The light from the eastern window made a long, warm square across the floor. I sat down at the round table. I picked up my pen. The day began. She had seen me, not the version of me a difficult marriage had made smaller, not the version a rigged courtroom had tried to define as decoration, not the version my own quiet accommodations had nearly erased. The real version, the one who had been here the whole time, the one she had known since I was small enough to sit at her kitchen table, with 4 watercolors and a piece of paper, and the absolute conviction that what I made mattered. She had seen me. She had built me a door, and I had walked through, and I was home, finally, completely home.